Hello and welcome to my podcast called Innervation. Innervation was inspired by my previous podcast, Silence, where over the course of 2 weeks, I ended up speaking with a total of 100 women from science, technology, engineering and mathematics, or STEM. I kept all of those guests anonymous so that they could talk openly and honestly about their lives, and we discussed their experiences and what they've learned along their life journeys, and their hopes and ideas for living fulfilling and contented lives. Because their identities were always kept safe, the conversations on Silence were always so raw and transparent, and we didn't just talk about being women in STEM, but about everything. The topics that tended to come up were topics that I discuss with my own friends and family, or my mentees ask me about, or sometimes when I give talks in schools and colleges, people will come up to me at the end and ask me the same questions. So I thought, rather than keep these topics closed, how about throwing them out into the world and letting everyone hear and engage in issues that are clearly important to many of us? What I've done is sift through all the episodes of Silence to bring you my favourite sound bites about these certain topics. Each week on Innervation, I'll be reflecting on the perspectives that came up on Silence that I feel are real pearls of wisdom that I found particularly provoking, inspiring and empowering, in the hope that they resonate with you too. This week is all about emotional intelligence. So, as I get older, I'm beginning to realise that emotional intelligence is really, really important. And actually, as time goes by, I feel like it's more important than academic intelligence. For a long, long time, particularly at the beginning of my life, all I wanted was to just prove myself academically. I wanted to really push my intelligence to the limit. And so I always was studying, I was always researching, I always wanted to be the top of my class. Everything was about school and education and books and knowledge. And actually, I think when I finished university, I realised that there's this whole other intelligence that we don't really learn about. And it's the kind of intelligence that you clock up just by doing life, having experiences, failing, just doing life on life's terms allows you to build up an emotional intelligence. And even though I hate to stereotype and it does make me cringe, what I've started to notice is that girls, females, tend to have a higher emotional intelligence, like a higher EQ, than boys do. And this might be the major difference between why boys go into STEM and why girls go into STEM less. I think there's this real sense that to go into STEM, you've got to have a really high IQ. And actually, as time goes on, we're all wanting much more diverse and inclusive teams. And actually, IQ is beginning to be as important in STEM fields as EQ. On Silence, I've often had guests talk about how they went off to have children, and as a result, they really built up an emotional intelligence, the ability to deal with their screaming babies, a tolerance and patience for the messiness of being a mother. And actually, they built up all these soft skills, which really increased their emotional intelligence. And not just through motherhood, but through a whole variety of female experiences. And I think overall, we do tend to have a much more attuned emotional intelligence. And that can often take up a lot of our internal broadband than our intellectual intelligence. But that's not to say that we can't have both. And from my experience, what I've noticed is that boys tend to be really pushed in the IQ area and less in the EQ area. And it's the reverse for girls. And so maybe we should be doing more to develop the EQ of boys and the IQ of girls. So that's my kind of latest theory, which is why I wanted to do a podcast about this subject, because I don't think it's that girls are incapable of STEM subjects. I just don't think they've got the confidence, or they've never really been pushed to develop their IQ, and therefore they haven't had tools necessary to equip them to go into STEM. And that needs to change. So one of my guests on Silence was in industrial engineering and design and mechanical engineering, and she gives her opinion on the importance of emotional intelligence within her industry.
I would love to see more emotional intelligence in our industry. Yes.
I think that's why there is such an awareness around diversity and inclusivity within STEM, because I think if you only have people on a team that have high IQs in maths and physics and other kind of STEM subjects, you're really missing out on that emotional, empathetic, compassionate side of things, which other people who are less trained in those subjects can bring to the table. And I think the reason why we haven't had more diversity and inclusion is because often when you come with those skills, you're kind of nudged out because you're made to feel really less than for having those softer skills. I'm air quoting right now. And, you know, they may be softer skills because they're a bit more warm and fuzzy, but they're certainly really important skills to have. And they certainly make for a much more well-rounded project than if you're going in sort of guns blazing, trying to make more money and trying to be the biggest, the fastest, the grandest solution, particularly in engineering. And so I couldn't agree more with my guest from episode 10, where industries like mechanical engineering definitely need more emotional intelligence.
Mechanical engineers, we're designing things for real people to use. And I think having a high emotional intelligence would really help with even just the design itself, thinking about your end user in a more complete way, I think would help design. And I think that's something I'm bringing right now to the company, and why a lot of people were kind of doubtful of my style, because the questions I would ask, like, well, does the customer really want this, or does the customer mean actually this?
So how does one get more emotional intelligence? That's the $1 million or $1 billion question. And I think something that women tend to do, and, you know, it's something that I definitely do, is a lot of self-reflection and a lot of thinking. Maybe I can be accused of analysis paralysis, but I really do spend a lot of time sort of thinking about the way I come across and the way people come across to me, and boundaries, and trying to be a responsible person that's mature and all of that. And I think when we self-reflect, it can really allow us to develop an emotional intelligence. I mean, emotional intelligence really determines how you are in the world and how the world is towards you. It's very much about how we come across, the way we talk, the way we act, being conscious of our behaviour, caring about people's feelings, knowing what feelings you're having. I mean, some people actually go through life not even being able to talk about how they feel. And in those cases, they have a very low emotional intelligence. I remember once talking to someone, and they said that whenever they were asked how they felt, they would resort to answers like, I feel a bit cold, or I feel a bit hot, or, you know, that's not emotional intelligence, because that has nothing to do with emotions. That's to do with temperature. But some people are just very much not in tune with their emotions. And I think when we self-reflect, particularly during times of meditation, when we're on our own and we can really check in with ourselves, that's when we can develop an emotional intelligence. It's understanding how we feel. It's getting to know the language of the heart rather than developing our brains all the time, which, we're trained to do in school. So here's a soundbite that almost summarizes that from episode 74.
I think self-reflection is the most important thing. It's, the whole emotional intelligence piece. I think self-reflection, if anyone wants to know where to start, that should be where to start. Think about what is it that you do every day? What is it that makes you happy? What is it that you contribute to a conversation when you're in a group? All that kinds of things. Looking at how you think, how you do, all of that is really important.
And it is really important. I've often been dismissed as like, why do you concentrate on things like that? It's not important, stick to facts and figures and data and things like that. But it is important. These are seen as softer skills or just warm and fuzziness that is unnecessary and maybe even gets in the way or can be obstacles to the end goal or the final destination. And I think emotional intelligence allows us to have a more rich experience of being human. I think a lot of people are very scared to face the language of their hearts and would much rather be kind of more mechanical robots than human beings that feel sad or feel happy or feel joy or feel laughter or humour or even feel grief. I mean, how often do we try and shove our feelings down when we're feeling sad? Grief and losing people can be the most awful experience of our lives, but some people just kind of pull their socks up and get on with it. And that isn't emotionally intelligent because, in my experience, shoving feelings down means that they pop up elsewhere. Or you might shove them down for long enough that suddenly you just have a massive tsunami of emotions wash over you at some random period in your life, and it can really knock you off your course. So I think it's important to develop an emotional intelligence so that you can deal with it on a daily basis. You can deal with your feelings on a sort of much more consistent basis rather than putting it all on hold and then it sort of bursting out when you least expect it. And I think the resistance and obstacles to doing that is a fear of facing oneself. I think sometimes it can be very difficult to look in the mirror and really be honest about the image that's looking back at you. Sometimes we want to be so much more than we are, and we want to be thinner, and we want to be cleverer, and we want to be more liked. But actually the reality is we're not there yet. And some people just don't want to face that. And again, I don't think that's emotionally intelligent. I think it's really important to just get present and to really face who we are today, because by showing that vulnerability and by showing an understanding and being aware of our weaknesses and our sort of our fragile points of our personality, we can actually empower ourselves. And that's what I think my guest from episode 79 is saying in very different words, but that's the sentiment I get from her.
As you grow higher, your knowledge actually keeps reducing because you have to keep expanding it.
Yeah.
That whole learning in every aspect, learning in the people you meet, learning in the things you do, learning real courses, and just the emotional intelligence of that period is so critical. So now when I'm sitting and having conversation with my colleagues, finding answers to problems, we are all exploring, and as you go higher, you realize nobody knows what's right or wrong. We are all working with intuition. We are all trying to use the best of what we know. And yes, the more we try to do something, and if we are happy to fail, we'll probably reach there faster because we would have tried a lot more things. And that again is a mindset that doesn't come inherently to everyone. and not to our generation.
I think it is really emotionally intelligent to want to learn more about being you. Growing and learning and evolving as a human being is an act of emotional intelligence. To actually want to do that, to not be in denial of where you're at in life and what you've reached and your kind of level of emotional maturity, is a sign of emotional intelligence. I think, it's something women tend to be so much more frank about that. But as a result, the downside of emotional intelligence is that we tend to be less confident and we tend to be more self-doubting. But rather than see self-doubt as a hindrance, we should actually embrace it, because I think it just is such a sign of emotional intelligence that we want to be better people. Often, people can walk into our lives and just say, oh gosh, you don't have much confidence. But actually, I think people that have too much confidence don't do themselves much good, because they're not being vulnerable. They're not claiming where they could improve. They're just in denial. It's a kind of form of ego and arrogance, which I just think catches up with you in the end. Whereas I think if we have the humility to say, yeah, I have strengths and weaknesses, and I'm working on my weaknesses, I think that is incredibly empowered. And I think if we're able to spot the vulnerabilities in ourselves, then we're able to spot the vulnerabilities in others and have compassion and kindness and love for them. And so on that, I'll leave you with a quote from episode 45, which I think sums up the importance of emotional intelligence.
Regardless of whether or not you're male or female, emotional intelligence, being able to understand people and being able to show empathy should be a thing for both sexes.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for listening. Please do subscribe to this podcast and maybe even rate and review if you can. I'd love to have your feedback about this episode or any others that you've listened to, and maybe even some suggestions for future topics on this show. It's all about self-discovery and evolution on Innervation, so if there are any issues which you feel are holding you back from living to your fullest potential, then I'd love to delve into that by drawing upon the wisdom and experiences of my amazing guests. Be kind and loving to yourselves, and I wish you all a great week.